Who will be the next Indiana? That's the question that we're setting out to answer today, as we're going to break down each conference. Who are the favorites, the dark horses? Who has maybe a small chance to make a push for that conference title? And which teams is it just not happening this year? So, starting with the ACC, these are the four teams that we would say are the favorites to win the conference championship. It's going to be between Louisville, SMU, Clemson, and Miami.
Yeah, Clemson, I think, is easily the front runner, bringing back Cade Klubnik at starting quarterback and having arguably two of the best defenders in the entire league, that being Peter Woods and TJ Parker. Having elite players on both sides of the ball is a recipe for success. And Dabo actually started using the transfer portal, so they built an excellent team. Miami bringing in Carson Beck to be their starting quarterback, replacing Cam Ward. While that is still a little bit of a downgrade, still going to be an elite offense. And I think the defense is making some strides forward. SMU, Kevin Jennings back as their starting quarterback after their college football playoff appearance, hoping to build off of that success and maybe not get blown out at Beaver Stadium. And then Louisville, after a pretty underrated season that also saw them beat Clemson last year, I think they're in a prime position to make a little bit of a run, bringing in Miller Moss out of USC to replace Tyler Shuff. And I think they're going to be the young and hungry team to challenge these top dogs.
Yeah, and I think another interesting thing to note, Clemson and Miami are the only two teams in this tier who do not play each other. So there's going to be a lot of infighting between these teams. It's really going to get sorted out in a pretty fair way, I think. So moving on, let's take a look at the dark horses for the conference. And we really like Georgia Tech bringing back Haynes King as well as Duke, who seems to surprise people every year. Now they're paying Darian Mensah $2 million dollars a year to transfer from Tulane. Duke could maybe also be a surprise team.
Yeah, especially considering Duke has been very consistent over the past few seasons. They finished 9-4 last season, the same conference record as Georgia Tech, but two additional wins out of conference. So Duke is in a very good spot, like you said, bringing in Darian Mensah after a very solid season at Tulane. And Georgia Tech has been very active in the transfer portal, bringing in two FIU receivers, one of those being Eric Rivers, who's expected to be a very key weapon. So I think Georgia Tech has a lot of potential to break out in the ACC with a very easy schedule too.
Yeah, both of these teams have pretty easy schedules. They play each other and they play Clemson, but both of them avoid Louisville, Miami, and SMU. So that's one of the reasons that they're able to be considered a dark horse and potentially next year's Indiana. Next up is the small chance tier. These are the teams that really have some question marks, but if everything goes their way, and if they win a few tough games, it's not completely out of the question just because they have enough talent to maybe get there. Florida State makes a return after having an abysmal season last season. Pitt bringing back Eli Holstein. North Carolina with Bill Belichick becoming the head coach. And Virginia Tech returning Kyron Drones at quarterback.
All these teams have potential. I'd say Pitt and Virginia Tech are the consistency from last season with their starting quarterbacks returning and just a lot of starting production returning. Whereas Florida State and North Carolina have really built their teams out of the transfer portal. I think Bill Belichick, being the head coach, is just bringing in a wave of players to North Carolina that they wouldn't otherwise get to recruit. And Thomas Castellanos going to Florida State along with so many other recruits and transfers, I think is going to play a key role in Florida State rebounding from that 2-10 season. But I do think with either schedule difficulty or, like you said, those question marks, these teams are in a separate tier.
Moving on to the last tier, these are the teams that unfortunately it's just not happening this year. And quickly, I want to touch on NC State because they're maybe the only team who could be considered for small chance. But the reason we said not happening is the schedule. They got a road trip to Duke, road trip to Notre Dame, road trip to Pitt, road trip to Miami, and they play Georgia Tech, Florida State, and North Carolina at home. I just don't really see it for NC State. They would have to win way too many games that I just don't really see them winning.
They're also just a really young team. So Every single thing would have to break right for them and then some. But the rest of these teams, just either bad teams consistently over the past few years or losing a lot of their starting production from last year. That's what we see from Cal and Syracuse. Cal McCord off to the NFL, and he was the focal point of Syracuse's spectacular season last year. And Cal losing Jaden Ott along with the current battle between the boosters and the football program is just creating some distractions that is causing a lot of the players to leave. So Cal, even though we were initially very high on them, have dramatically dropped.
And then, I mean, Wake Forest and Stanford, I don't really think they need much talking about. Those two are going to be some of the worst teams in the conference. Boston College is an interesting team. Losing Thomas Castellanos really hurt, I think. However, he was out most of the season last year, and they did all right getting to 7-6. But as far as actually making a push at the conference title, I really don't see it happening for Boston College. The schedule also not super easy. They play Notre Dame as well, along with Clemson and SMU. Not an easy schedule for Boston College. So just they're not going to do it this season.
And then with Virginia, their schedule is pretty difficult. Their team is not as strong, and they've not really been a great team over the last few years. I think it's just a product of having a mediocre team with a pretty difficult schedule. They're just not in a position to compete.
Moving on to the Big Ten, let's take a look at the favorites. It's pretty clear in this conference. It's going to be Ohio State, it's going to be Oregon, and Penn State.
Without a doubt, these teams were at the top of the conference last year. They're going to be at the top of the conference again. Ohio State coming off their national championship, having to replace 14 players that were drafted, along with, I believe, 3 or 4 undrafted free agents. But every single year, they don't have to rebuild. It's just retooling. When you have arguably the best offensive and defensive player in the country on your roster with Jeremiah Smith and Caleb Downs, they're going to be pretty good. Oregon coming off that undefeated regular season, having replaced Dylan Gabriel along with a couple key offensive and defensive players. I think Dan Lanning is still going to be able to get the job done. I think he's going to turn Dante Moore into a serviceable quarterback with the weapons he has around him. And then Penn State might be the favorite in the Big Ten early on because they have so much returning production with Katron Allen, Drew Aller, and Nick Singleton. They have a very good young edge rusher. Once again, what a surprise. And they brought in Jim Knowles to be their defensive coordinator after his national championship with Ohio State last year. These are without a doubt the top dogs in the Big Ten.
Next up is the dark horses. We'll start off with Illinois. A lot of people really high on this Illinois team saying that maybe they could be next year's Indiana. Personally, I think they're going to lose at least 2 games. Obviously, you have the Ohio State one, but Duke on the road in the non-conference isn't easy, as well as 2 road Big Ten games with Indiana and Washington. I think that's going to be pretty tough. Washington, I think, has a really good chance also, but again, they play Ohio State, they play Oregon, and they play at Michigan. So not super easy there either. Those are 3 really tough games. And I didn't even mention Illinois at home for them. And then for Michigan, with their schedule, obviously, they're playing Ohio State. And then on top of that, like I just said, Washington at home. We actually like Michigan State a decent amount, but outside of that, nothing super crazy. You got the non-conference with Oklahoma. Going to be a few tough games, which is why they weren't in the favorites tier, but also having a true freshman quarterback going to limit them a little bit as well.
Yeah, defensively, Michigan's going to be in the same kind of tier as we've seen them over the past few years. I would say like 1B essentially. Definitely just a slight step ahead of Washington and Illinois. But Illinois, with their returning production, going to be pretty solid, but their schedule is going to limit them. Same with Washington and also Damon Williams, even though he was very good in replacing Will Rogers a couple times last season, he is still pretty young. So we really need to see him take that next step with a full season.
Next up are the teams with a small chance, and there's a decent amount of them here. I'm going to start it off with Michigan State, actually. I kind of just want to run it through their schedule a little bit. The non-conference, pretty easy, and just a few tricky games that if they can win on the road, I kind of like them on the road against USC. The big ones, you got Indiana on the road, Michigan at home, Minnesota on the road, and Penn State at home, all four of those in a row. I mean, if they can win two of those, maybe they lose to Michigan and Penn State. There's an argument for Michigan State to make the playoffs as a 10 and 2 team. Obviously, it's going to take a lot. That's why they're in the small chance tier, but it is not impossible for the Spartans.
Yeah, especially with that young QB wide receiver duo of Aiden Childs and Nick Marsh. With Minnesota and Indiana, Minnesota's just been consistent in the Big Ten year after year. I think PJ Fleck is very underrated both in the Big Ten and in just college football in general as a head coach. I think that consistency kind of backs up that case. And then Indiana, after a spectacular season last year that saw them get a college football playoff appearance, bringing in Fernando Mendoza from Cal to replace Curtis Rourke, I think that's a great move. I think the wide receiver room is pretty solid, and it's just a matter of they need to win those couple key games they have on their schedule. I just don't really think they're going to be able to have just the same amount of success as they did last year. There's at least two games on the schedule that I could see them losing.
For Indiana, it's Oregon and Penn State both on the road. And for Minnesota, they go on the road to both Ohio State and Oregon. So two of the top teams in the conference for both of them. That's why it's only a small chance because they really only have a chance to get to 10 and 2. As for USC, Jordan Mailata is going to be the quarterback, and the schedule not super easy. Road trips to Oregon and Notre Dame and Illinois. They get Michigan at home though. Maybe they upset Illinois on the road, beat Michigan at home. If you can limit the two losses to Notre Dame and Oregon, there is a slight chance.
And then to round it out with this tier, we have Nebraska. We saw last year that they gave Ohio State a run for their money. I definitely think defensively they were very, very good and maybe a little underrated last year. Still have Dylan Raiola, mini Patrick Mahomes as their starting quarterback, and he seems to get better season after season. I just don't think with the schedule and just some other questions that they're going to be able to really elevate themselves and get into that next tier where they actually have a chance. So just a small chance here.
Yeah, and out of these five teams, Nebraska does have the easiest schedule. Toughest games at Penn State, Michigan at home. Outside of that, everything is pretty manageable. We've just been so used to seeing Nebraska choke in all of these close games. We can't really move them up to the dark horse tier until they prove that they can actually win when the time comes and it matters. As for the teams where it's just not happening, I think it's pretty self-explanatory for all of these. We'll start with Wisconsin. The schedule is just absolutely brutal. I don't want to say that a bowl game is not happening, but I would be shocked if it does because of how terrible the schedule is.
Yeah, having Michigan on the road, Ohio State at home, Oregon on the road, Washington at home, essentially in back-to-back games, along with Illinois and Indiana. It's just a brutal schedule. They're probably the best team out of this tier, them or Iowa. Iowa also has just a pretty difficult schedule, and even though they have solid defense, their offense just isn't what it needs to be to compete in the Big Ten. As for the rest of these teams, Rutgers, Northwestern, Maryland, UCLA, and Purdue, they're just either too young and inexperienced, don't have enough weapons to support some of their best players, or they're just flat out bad, like Maryland and Purdue. They just have no one on their roster that really elevates their team, and that's why none of these teams really have a chance.
Moving on to the Big 12. Again, pretty clear who the favorites are, even though the Big 12 is one of the most chaotic conferences every year. Arizona State, Kansas State, BYU, and Iowa State are definitely the top four teams in the conference.
All these teams have starting quarterbacks returning from last year. Some of the best starting quarterbacks returning. Got Jake Retzlaff for BYU. Rocco Becht for Iowa State, Sam Levitt for Arizona State, and Avery Johnson for Kansas State. Solid weapons returning as well. Arizona State, I think, is probably the biggest favorite in the Big 12 because of their college football playoff appearance last year. Yes, they're replacing Cam Scadaboo, but the rest of their offense is pretty much intact. So I would be surprised if these teams do not find themselves in the top half of the conference next season.
Moving on, we have the dark horses, and we'll start it off with Texas Tech. The Red Raiders spent a ton of money this offseason upgrading their facilities and bringing in the number two transfer portal class. Definitely flying under the radar a little bit. But here's the thing, they play at Arizona State, they play BYU at home. They're probably going to be upset at some point because the Big 12 is just full of upsets. But if you can win one of the two big games, a 10-2 Texas Tech has a very good chance to make the conference championship or maybe get considered for an at-large bid if they just miss out on the title game.
Texas Tech is, I believe, Jonah's dark horse team, not just for the Big 12, but for all of college football next year. But for me, it's Baylor. Baylor has is kind of the opposite of Texas Tech. They just have so much returning production coming back. They have starting quarterback Sawyer Robertson back for another year. They have both their running backs in Bryson Washington and Dawson Pendergrass returning, and the receiving core is pretty much intact as well. Both these teams, I think, finished with the same record last year, and I think both are going to be in contention for a Big 12 title with all that returning production.
Key matchups for Baylor going to be on the road against SMU pretty early on, not even mentioning the Friday night game to start the season against Auburn. Those two are huge. But as for the Big 12, it's Arizona State at home and Kansas State at home. So if you can win one of those two, it doesn't even matter if you lose the non-conference games if you can get to the Big 12 championship with just one conference loss. Moving on to the small chance teams, it's going to be Colorado. I mean, with Deion Sanders, you never know. They bring in Caden Salter, who I really like out of the transfer portal. However, the reason that Colorado is in this tier is because the schedule is so difficult, playing all four of our top tier teams, as well as TCU and Georgia Tech in the non-conference, who, like we said earlier, we are pretty high on.
Then we look at Utah. Utah bringing in Devin Dampier and Wayshawn Parker transfers for their starting quarterback and starting running back. But they've just been a pretty disappointing team over the past few years. We get to this point in the season, we start hyping them up. They end up being like a top 15 team to start the season, and then we see them fall out within the first couple of weeks. But I do think there is a slight chance. We saw them compete in a lot of games last year, especially against, I believe, Arizona State and almost winning the Holy War against BYU. But everything just needs to break right for the Utes here. So that's why we're going to give them a small chance.
Next is going to be TCU. And we actually did a blind comparison with TCU's quarterback, Josh Hoover. And he has very similar stats to one of the Heisman favorites for next season, either Cade Klubnik or Garrett Nussmeier. I can't remember which one we had in there. Both of them were pretty similar stats wise, though. And TCU, the main reason that they're in the small chance tier and not the dark horse, they lost the majority of their wide receiver room to the NFL draft. Got a lot of talent to replace there. But if young guys step up and Josh Hoover can play up to that potential, not only could we potentially see him as a dark horse in the Heisman race, we could see TCU as a dark horse in the playoff race.
And then finally in this tier, we have Kansas. Kansas had lots of high hopes last year, really big expectations that they fell short of. But I think Jalen Daniels can lead this team once again and really bounce back, having a solid season. Really, they're just held back by a pretty difficult schedule, along with just having to replace a couple key guys on the offensive and defensive side of the ball. Those key matchups include a road trip to Texas Tech, hosting their in-state rivals in Kansas State, and also playing on the road against Iowa State. But if you win against either Kansas State or Iowa State, then they have a solid chance. But I do think they're just a slight step down from our dark horse tier.
Next up For these teams, it is just not happening in 2025. Really, all of these are pretty self-explanatory. These were some of the worst teams in the Big 12 last season. Not tons of improvements were made. Some teams like Arizona, while Fafita's coming back, they lost their biggest offensive producer in Tateroa McMillan. Oklahoma State lost Ollie Gordon, even though he had a very disappointing season. The whole Oklahoma State team was incredibly disappointing. I'd say Houston is maybe the best team in this tier. I guess I'll let you talk about that a little bit, Connor.
Yeah, Houston's bringing in Connor Wegman from Texas A&M to be their starting quarterback. Had some ups and downs at A&M, but definitely a step up from the quarterback position that Houston had last season. So we could see them be a pretty competitive team. I just don't think with their schedule that they're going to be able to really elevate to a higher level. I would also argue that Cincinnati might be the best team in this tier, returning Brendan Sorsby at the starting quarterback position. They were the best team out of these six teams, except for West Virginia last season, but I think they are probably the most competitive team out of these six. West Virginia just lost so many people. I believe they lost 22 players in one day and have lost, I think, 53 since the spring transfer window opened. So West Virginia is just going to be completely gutted. Cincinnati has potential to be competitive, but I really don't think that they're going to be able to elevate to the level of TCU or Kansas. Then UCF losing their biggest playmaker in RJ Harvey to the NFL draft. The rest of their team was not very good. So losing your star player just not going to keep you competitive. So they're going to be in the not happening tier.
Moving on to the SEC, got four favorites here. A little bit of separation, I'd say, between Texas and Georgia, down to Alabama and LSU. However, I think that Alabama and LSU are just too good to be called dark horses.
Alabama having replaced Jalen Milroe, but they're having a pretty good quarterback battle, and I think whoever ends up winning it is going to be very solid. And you still have Ryan Williams to throw to, so their offense is going to be just fine. I think year two under Kalen DeBoer is going to be phenomenal. Then LSU is the complete opposite. They have Garrett Nussmeier returning as their starting quarterback. He's a Heisman favorite. Their offense and defense is going to be insane as it usually is because they recruit so well. Just on the shoulders of Brian Kelly to finally get it done. But like you said, Texas and Georgia are in a tier of their own. Arch Manning for Texas and Gunnar Stockton for Georgia. Gunnar Stockton just having a little bit of playing experience, kind of around the same as Arch Manning, but both are just surrounded by so many weapons and just insane defenses that they are easily the top two teams in the SEC.
Yeah, both of them falling in the college football playoff to the teams that made the national championship. Texas to Ohio State, Georgia to Notre Dame. And the schedules, they're going to be tough. They both play each other as well. So definitely going to be fun matchups. However, Texas does not play Alabama or LSU. Georgia plays Alabama. LSU able to avoid both Texas and Georgia. They do have to play Bama, though, as well as a few of our dark horse teams. And that would be South Carolina, Oklahoma, and Florida. The Tigers have all three of these on their schedule.
Yeah, Florida, I think, is the team everyone's kind of hopping on the bandwagon for. DJ Lagway showed lots of signs of being a very, very great quarterback. If it wasn't for his injury, Florida probably would have beaten Georgia last season. And I think with a fully healthy year, Florida's going to be really, really tough to beat. South Carolina was one or two games away from making the college football playoffs to begin with, and now they're returning Lenore Sellers at the quarterback position. I think South Carolina is in for a phenomenal season and really has a legitimate chance to compete for that SEC title.
And as for Oklahoma, they have a tough non-conference matchup with Michigan, as well as not a super easy SEC schedule. However, they are bringing in arguably the top quarterback in the transfer portal, John Montier, out of Washington State, and we saw how Washington State transfers did last season with Cam Ward going number one overall in the NFL draft. They also got arguably the top running back in the transfer portal with Jaden Ott out of California. So this Oklahoma team has some serious talent. They struggled a lot in their first year in the SEC. This season is definitely one to watch out for the Sooners in. Next is the small chance tier. These teams maybe are a little bit surprising to some of you to see Ole Miss down here, as well as Tennessee. Tennessee, I think it's pretty obvious. They lost Nico. That's going to hurt them a significant amount. As for Ole Miss, Jackson Dart was the starter for 4 years. They have a redshirt freshman, Austin Simmons, who they are very excited about. However, schedule's not super easy. They play LSU, they play Georgia, they play South Carolina, at Oklahoma, they play Florida as well. Not easy whatsoever.
Yeah, I just think with the people Ole Miss is losing, it's just going to be t it's going to be tough for Lane Kiffin to get his team back into college football playoff contention. But who knows? Maybe Austin Simmons is the next Jackson Dart. I also just saw something today that was pretty funny that Austin Simmons actually got his first degree. He came to Ole Miss 2 years early. He graduated high school 2 years early. So maybe those school smarts are going to translate to the football field. But then looking at Texas A&M, they have Marcel Reed returning as their starting quarterback after a okay year last year after taking over for Connor Weigman. But I think with a full year under his belt, he'll be able to really shine. I just think their schedule is very difficult, having Florida, LSU, and South Carolina along with their rivalry game against Texas. I just think it's gonna be a little difficult to see this team get to only two losses in conference.
Yeah, and then finally is Auburn. A lot of people are hyping up the Tigers in 2025, and there's good reason for it. Not to mention, they have a pretty easy schedule. The SEC schedule, you got a road trip to Oklahoma and Texas A&M, and then the two toughest games, Georgia at home and Alabama at home. So it's not impossible to say that Auburn could finish with a pretty solid record in 2025. However, with a lot of question marks that have a good chance of being answered. We just don't know for sure. They have to be in the small chance tier, but maybe could make a push towards that dark horse tier once we know a little bit more.
For sure. But taking a look at the final tier, the not happening tier, I think the biggest surprise for people here is going to be Mizzou and Vandy. Now, Vandy, everyone loves after last season. They were the Cinderella team that everyone felt that they could cheer for, with Diego Pavia just being a great person to see his personality, but their schedule is just too difficult, along with having some questions at key positions. I just don't think it's gonna in the cards for them to go back-to-back years with Cinderella runs. And the Mizzou, I think they were very overrated last year. There were so many times I thought they should have been out of the top 25, but they still snuck in at 24. But now they are losing Brady Cook and Luther Burden, their key offensive contributors. While they have brought in some replacements and recruited some highly touted prospects, I just don't think with their schedule they're going to be able to remain in that second tier of SEC teams. So I just don't think it's in the cards for them to compete this year.
Yeah, another team that people would maybe be a little bit disappointed to see here is going to be Arkansas. However, they added Notre Dame in the non-conference. Very, very tough game to win. It is at home though. The SEC schedule, road trip to Ole Miss, road trip to Tennessee, road trip to LSU, road trip to Texas, and turn at home as well as Texas A&M at home.
And then to round it out, we have the bottom feeders of the SEC, the teams that no one is surprised to see. Kentucky and Mississippi State, just really no players to really write home about. Kentucky losing their best defensive players to the NFL draft in Maxwell Hairston and Deion Walker. And then Mississippi State just was flat out horrible last year. They would need a lot to go right for them and I don't think they've done enough to even warrant a possible chance in the SEC.
Yeah, I would definitely be shocked if Kentucky and Mississippi State were not the bottom two teams in the SEC next season. But thank you guys for watching. Please make sure to like and subscribe. And we're going to be moving into our prediction series. Tomorrow is our spring top 25. After that, we're going to start releasing videos officially predicting every team's record for 2025 based on those top 25 rankings. So if you want to know roughly when your team's video is going to be out, go watch the top 25 tomorrow. And we'll see you in the next one.